Hi there everyone, how are you doing? My name's Nadia and this channel is everything neurodiversity. As a neurodiverse person, it's really important for me has been really important for me to look into inequalities. Anti-oppression work and work that prioritizes people like me is really important. I want to explore why do people find equality so threatening, and therefore why is it so hard to implement and to integrate into society, practices and equality initiatives and things like that, because it's notoriously difficult to do. As you may or may not know, our culture has a certain structure about different identities and different categories of people. And so, because it's capitalist and because we come from a very loaded history, we don't just come from nowhere, we come from a history that has certain teachings and certain power structures that we all have to navigate ourselves around. That very power structure is used in the reason why it survived so long is because it has managed to build a framework which protects itself from change and from radical redressing or addressing power inequalities and damaging power dynamics. And so when you try to address inequalities and unfair treatment and discrimination, then there already exists a very well experienced, well kind of versed cultural norms around what is likely to happen. In England, we have quite a normal culture of hypocrisy. Part of the reason why that is the case is that our history is really loaded with hypocrisy, and so by that I mean a lot of us will kind of outwardly say that we're really into equality and all these things, but internally it might be a really different story. And when you look at English history, you can see that we have colonized a lot of the world, and yet we frame ourselves as like this benign pillar of democracy, even though a lot of Western, I mean, this goes for Neo-American culture as well, where a lot of Anglo and American influences across the world have actually been anti-democratic. For example, I think the CIA worked, or the Americans worked, to get Thomas Sankara assassinated in Burkina Faso in West Africa, even though he was an amazing feminist, essentially, and he really believed in equality and giving power to the people that were poor in Burkina Faso. It's the second poorest country in the world, again, because of colonization. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that we come from these places that have already set the narrative, and so if we don't actively try to do anti-oppression, then that narrative will continue and the narrative will reinforce itself. So again, that's why you have a lot of people who will claim to be into equality, claim to treat people equally, but a lot of the time that doesn't really happen, because unless they're doing active work, their default will be not doing that, because that's where we've come from. This goes across the board. This goes for me, like the way that you start being equal in your behaviors is you start to acknowledge that you are sexist, that you are transphobic, that you are racist, that you are ableist, that you are discriminatory towards people with mental health problems, because that's the kind of culture that certainly I come from as an English person. When we start to be able to acknowledge that, then we can start to disentangle it and undo it and reduce it, because we can't change what we can't see. We can't change what we don't perceive, right? So it's first about acknowledging that those things exist, and that is likely, I mean, how arrogant would it be for me to be like, I'm not sexist, even though like it's a mainstream culture that affects everyone apart from me. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, no, it's just not even like possible. Because we come from this culture, there are very unhelpful responses to someone raising concerns around mistreatment and harm. And for example, if you ask someone to be accountable, like 99% of the time, people will have a really bad reaction to that. And I will show you some examples of what people do when they're asked to be accountable. And the reason why this is so critical and why I wanted to mention it in this talk is because that's one of the keys to really implementing equalities properly, and for people to grow as individuals, and for cultures to grow and repair the damage that they've created as well. Here you can see quite a few examples of what people do when you ask them to be accountable for being harmful towards people. And again, this is relevant to equalities because it is disproportionately toward people that are marginalised and underrepresented groups that experience high levels of mistreatment because of the power structures I've already mentioned. So as you can tell, there are things like minimising. So if you approach someone and you're like, hey, like Karen, that thing you said was quite hurtful and it made me feel really down and yada yada yada. Or like, hey Bob, you know, when you said that about my disability, it was really damaging. Most people, unfortunately, have been taught to be like one of these approaches that I'm showing you. So minimizing it, or like being like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, you know, that's called gaslighting, when you make someone think that what they're saying is not real. So you start making them doubt their own sanity. It's all horrible stuff. But most people have been taught like to do that. If you think about when we're kids, when we're blamed for something, you're taught to be like, no, it wasn't me. You know, it's exactly what we do as adults as well. Here you can see what is really helpful when people ask for someone to be accountable, or a country to be accountable for like horrendous acts internationally. What would be helpful is acknowledgement of what has happened, and reflecting about those themes, and then committing to not repeating those actions. And that's really what is so important for a lot of equalities work, to ensure that we start actually to move in a different direction, which is much better. At the moment, we're in a situation where people and institutions are all claiming that they're really into equality and they love equality.com, but it's all on face value, it's lip service, because they're not doing it, they're not internalizing these practices. And a really central component of equalities work is something we call reflexive practice. So that's when you reflect and you do this accountability work. Say someone came to me and was like, Nadia, I feel like this is quite a racist behaviour that you're portraying. Yes, it might be uncomfortable. Yes, it might be difficult. And yes, I might even disagree with this. But that's not really what should be prioritised in that moment. I have to experience being uncomfortable, because that's not always a bad thing. It's not a good thing when someone's crossing your boundaries in a, you know, safety way. That's not okay. But if you're conceptually uncomfortable because your privileges are being challenged, that's very different. So I would really encourage you to try and get into that state where, yes, you feel guilty and uncomfortable because someone's raised these issues with you, but actually this is an opportunity. It's not an attack. Certainly not it might be an attack on your privileges, but that's actually quite a good thing. If your privileges are excessive. That brings me on to, wait, have I finished that point? Yeah. A lot of people get very emotional about these topics, and again, it's because of the structures that I talked about initially, where it's all kind of built according to how can we protect our privileges. But I think what I'm trying to emphasize is that there are some people that have a lot more privileges than other people, and our culture compliments those people and rewards those people and those dynamics and identities. We've been taught to really ruthlessly defend our privileges a lot of the time. And so that's why when you get any kind of dynamic where someone with more privilege has harmed someone with less privilege, and that person with less privilege might come to that person and explain that to them, That's why you often get really bad responses from people, because they've been taught to defend their privileges, even if that's not okay, you know, in a moral sense. And also they've been taught to frame themselves as the victim in that narrative. So that's why you get the whole stereotype of like when a person of colour talks to a white person about their racialized issues, and then the white person makes a big drama and like makes everyone feel sorry for them, further victimizing the initial problem and the person who's been harmed initially. This is kind of very similar across the board. So a lot of the time, if women or non-men will approach men about issues, again you'll have a similar thing of not accepting and also framing that person as the one attacking the privileged category. So there's a lot of very frustrating dynamics here, because what would be fantastic is just people to acknowledge their behaviour and acknowledge their mistakes, but that seldom happens, unfortunately. And that is critically what we need to happen in order to grow up, basically, as people and as a community. I think what needs to be remembered is that when someone's trying to ask for us as people or as institutions or as countries to be accountable, what we need to remember is that this is an opportunity to learn and to grow, and so this person isn't a demonizable person that we can ostracize and attack. That's a very unevolved approach. Unfortunately, it's the normal approach, and one that I've experienced hundreds of times, and I'm sure many other people have. But it's a waste of everyone's time, because it develops people to reflect and to acknowledge their mistakes and to learn from their problems and their issues. Because if they never do that, and that's the kind of state that we're in, it doesn't serve anyone any good. It's impossible to have, it's impossible to be that kind of human. And it doesn't leave any space for anyone to be accountable and to learn and to grow. It's not good to be immature in how I deal with oppression and discrimination and bullying.